It was a cool evening, the sun slowly setting, casting long shadows across the hills of Galilee. The warmth of the day had faded, and a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves of the trees outside the small home where Jesus and his disciples had gathered for the evening. Inside, the dim light from the flickering oil lamps cast soft, golden hues across the walls, creating an atmosphere of calm and serenity. Yet, despite the stillness of the evening, the air in the room felt heavy, thick with the unspoken burdens carried by the men who sat at Jesus' feet. They were a weary group. The days had been long and filled with challenges, not just in their ministry and travels, but in their own personal struggles. Struggles that often weighed more heavily on their hearts than the physical exhaustion of the journey. Peter, always the first to speak, was uncharacteristically quiet. He sat by the fire, absent-mindedly tracing his fingers through the sand at his feet, his thoughts miles away. John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, stared pensively into the distance, his heart heavy with the deep compassion he felt for the suffering people they encountered daily. Thomas sat slightly apart from the group, a furrow of worry on his brow, his mind swirling with questions and doubts as it so often did. Each man in the room carried the weight of something unspoken, a fear, a failure, a regret, things they had not yet found the courage to share even with one another. Jesus, ever attuned to the hearts of his beloved friends, sensed the heaviness among them. His eyes, full of understanding and compassion, scanned the faces of his disciples, seeing not only the outward weariness but also the burdens of their spirits. He could see how the pressures of their mission and the trials they had faced had begun to wear them down, not just physically but emotionally and spiritually. After a long silence, Jesus spoke, his voice gentle yet filled with the kind of authority that always commanded their attention. "My dear friends," he said softly, "I can see the weight you are carrying. I know the struggles that weigh on your hearts. You have given much and the road has been long. But I want to tell you a story of brokenness and how, through love, even the most shattered things can be made whole again." The disciples looked up, their eyes meeting Jesus. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken agreement that they would listen, knowing that his words would provide the wisdom they so desperately needed. "There was once a man," Jesus began, "who owned a vase of extraordinary beauty. It had been passed down through generations in his family, each ancestor caring for it with great love and devotion. The vase was more than just an object to him. It was a symbol of his family's history, a reflection of the love that had been shared between those who had come before him. It was crafted from the finest clay, shaped with delicate hands, and adorned with intricate designs that told the story of his lineage. To the man, this vase was not just a possession, it was a part of his very soul." The disciples sat in rapt attention, the image of the precious vase forming vividly in their minds. They could sense the weight of the man's attachment to it, the significance it held in his heart. Each of them, in their own way, knew what it was like to hold something dear, something that represented more than its outward appearance. A symbol of love, a memory, a hope. One day, Jesus continued, the man decided to move the vase to a place of honor in his home, where it would be safe and protected, where he could look upon it each day and remember the love it represented. But as he lifted the vase to place it on the shelf, his hand slipped. In an instant, the vase tumbled from his grasp and fell to the floor. The sound of it shattering echoed through the room, and with it, the man's heart shattered too. Jesus paused for a moment, allowing the weight of the moment to sink in. The disciples too felt the man's pain, the heartbreak of seeing something so precious broken beyond repair. The man knelt down, Jesus continued, his hands trembling as he gathered the broken pieces of the vase. He wept, not only for the vase itself but for what it symbolized, the love, the memories, the legacy of his family. In his eyes, it was all gone, shattered beyond repair. For days he could not bear to look at the broken pieces. He placed them in a box and hid them away, hoping that by not seeing them, he could forget the pain. The disciples were silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts, reflecting on the brokenness in their own lives. Peter, who had often spoken with such confidence and boldness, felt a deep connection to the man in the story. He thought of the times when his own impulsiveness had led to failure, times when he had spoken too quickly, acted too rashly, and later regretted his actions. He had failed Jesus before, and the weight of that failure still lingered in his heart, like the broken pieces of the vase hidden away. "I know what it feels like to be broken," Peter said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are moments when I felt like I've shattered everything, like I've failed beyond repair. How do you move forward when something precious has been lost?" The other disciples nodded, their faces reflecting the weight of their own personal struggles. Each of them had their own moments of brokenness, moments when they had doubted their worth, their ability, or their purpose. Thomas, in particular, felt the weight of doubt pressing down on him as it so often did. He had always struggled to trust fully, to believe without questioning, and he wondered if that made him less worthy in Jesus' eyes. "Master," Thomas said hesitantly, "sometimes I feel as though I'm more like the broken vase than the man who owned it. My doubts, my questions, they make me feel shattered, like I'm not whole. How can someone like me be made whole again?" Jesus looked at Thomas with deep tenderness, his eyes filled with understanding. "Thomas," he said softly, "your doubts do not make you less worthy. They are part of your journey, part of the process of being made whole. Just as the vase was not ruined by its brokenness, neither are you. There is more to the story." "One day," Jesus continued, "a wise and skilled craftsman came to visit the man. He saw the sorrow in the man's eyes and asked, 'Why do you weep, my friend?' The man at first was hesitant to speak of his loss, ashamed to show the broken pieces of the vase that had meant so much to him. But after a moment he brought out the box containing the fragments and, with a heavy heart, showed them to the craftsman. 'This was my most precious possession,' the man said, his voice thick with grief. 'It was whole, perfect, a reflection of the love and legacy of my family. But now it is ruined, broken beyond repair. It can never be as it once was.' The craftsman studied the broken pieces, turning them over in his hands with great care. He was silent for a long time, then he smiled. 'It is not ruined,' he said gently. 'It can be made whole again, perhaps even more beautiful than before.' The man was confused. 'How can that be?' he asked. 'The vase is shattered into too many pieces. It can never be the same.' 'No,' the craftsman agreed, 'it will never be the same. But it can become something new, something even more beautiful than what it once was. Trust me. Let me show you.' Jesus' voice softened as he continued the story, and the disciples leaned in, captivated by the unfolding lesson. The man, though doubtful, agreed to let the craftsman try. The craftsman gathered the broken pieces and began his work. But he did not attempt to hide the cracks or pretend that the vase had never been broken. Instead, he used a special lacquer mixed with powdered gold to bind the fragments together. Slowly, with great patience and care, he pieced the vase back together, but now the cracks that had once been scars were filled with radiant veins of gold. When the craftsman was finished, he handed the vase back to the man. The man was speechless. The vase, though no longer perfect, had been transformed into something even more beautiful than it had been before. The golden lines that traced the cracks gave it a unique beauty, a beauty born not from its perfection, but from its brokenness. The room was silent as Jesus paused, allowing the disciples to absorb the full meaning of the story. The image of the vase, once shattered and now mended with gold, resonated deeply with each of them. They understood now that their own brokenness, their doubts, their failures, their imperfections, did not make them less worthy. In fact, it was through their brokenness that God's grace could work most powerfully. John, who had always been sensitive to the emotional and spiritual needs of those around him, spoke next. "So, Master," he said quietly, "you are saying that our brokenness, our wounds, these are not things to be ashamed of? That through God's love, even the cracks in our hearts can be made into something beautiful?" Jesus smiled, his eyes filled with love. "Yes, John," he said softly. The cracks in your heart, the wounds you carry, they are not signs of your failure. They are places where God's grace can shine through. Just as the craftsman used gold to mend the vase, God uses His love to heal your brokenness. And in doing so, He makes you more whole, more beautiful than you ever were before. The disciples were deeply moved by Jesus' words. They had all experienced moments of doubt and failure, times when they felt unworthy of the mission they had been given, unworthy of the love and trust Jesus had shown them. But now they saw their brokenness in a new light. They saw it not as something to hide or be ashamed of, but as a place where God's transformative power could be at work. Peter, who had often struggled with the weight of his own impulsiveness and mistakes, felt a deep sense of relief wash over him. He had carried the guilt of his failures for so long, feeling as though he could never truly make up for them. But now he understood that it was not about erasing the past or pretending that his mistakes had never happened. It was about allowing God to take those broken pieces and make something new from them, something even more beautiful than what had been before. Tears filled Peter's eyes as he looked at Jesus. "Lord," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "I've failed you so many times. I've denied you, I've doubted you. How can I be made whole again?" Jesus reached out and placed a hand on Peter's shoulder, his touch gentle and full of love. "Peter," he said, "you are not defined by your failures. You are defined by your willingness to allow God to work in your heart, to trust Him with your broken pieces. Like the vase, you will never be exactly as you once were. But that is not a loss, it is a transformation. Your brokenness makes room for God's love to fill the cracks, to make you something new. And that is where true beauty lies." The disciples sat in silence, tears in their eyes, as they reflected on the profound truth of Jesus' words. They had been so focused on their own weaknesses, their own perceived failures, that they had forgotten the power of God's grace to transform even the most broken among them. They realized now that their journey was not about achieving perfection, but about allowing themselves to be shaped and transformed by the hands of the divine. Thomas, whose doubts had always weighed heavily on him, felt a sense of peace for the first time in a long while. He had always feared that his questions and uncertainties made him less worthy, less faithful than the others. But now he understood that his doubts were not a sign of weakness, they were part of the process of being made whole. "Master," Thomas said quietly, "how do we learn to accept our brokenness? How do we trust that we can be made whole when the pieces seem too many to count?" Jesus looked at Thomas with great tenderness. "Thomas," he said, "acceptance does not mean you ignore your pain or pretend it does not exist. It means you acknowledge it, you make space for it, and you trust that God is at work even when you cannot see how. Commitment means staying with the process, even when it is hard, even when the broken pieces seem too many to count. You must trust in the hands of the craftsman, trust that God is creating something beautiful from what you cannot yet understand." The disciples felt a deep sense of peace settle over them as they sat in the presence of their beloved teacher. They had come to Jesus that evening burdened by their own brokenness, their own fears and doubts. But now they saw that their brokenness was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something new, a transformation that could only happen through God's love and grace. The image of the vase, mended with golden veins of grace, stayed with them, a powerful reminder of the truth they had learned. They understood now that their journey was not about avoiding mistakes or hiding their wounds. It was about allowing those wounds to be healed and transformed by God, becoming something even more beautiful than they had been before. One by one, the disciples gathered around Jesus, embracing Him, feeling the warmth of His love and the strength of His wisdom. The room, once heavy with unspoken burdens, was now filled with a quiet joy. The disciples knew that their journey would not be easy, but they also knew that they were not alone. Their brokenness had been acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement they found healing, purpose, and beauty. They had been shattered, but through the love of God, they were being made whole, one golden line at a time. Conclusion. Through this expanded and deeply emotional story, Jesus teaches the disciples profound lessons of acceptance and commitment. They learn to accept their brokenness, not as a sign of weakness, but as an opportunity for God's grace to work in them. They understand that through commitment to their faith, even when life seems shattered, God can create something more beautiful than they ever imagined. Their journey is one of transformation, where their broken pieces are mended with the golden threads of God's love, creating a beauty far greater than they had ever known. This is end of the story. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.